Hi everyone! If you've watched my videos before, welcome back. If this is the first video you're watching, welcome to the channel. My name is Tara and I work in the field of cloud computing and cloud security. I've been going through the new-ish TryHackMe attacking and defending AWS path and doing some video walkthroughs. I just finished the 2 rooms in the Introduction to AWS module, and now I'm ready to get into the next module, which is Introduction to IAM, Identity and Access Management in AWS. So it's getting good now. We're getting to the juicy stuff. If you have any feedback or questions on what you've seen so far in the video series, definitely let me know. And I am going to pull up TryHackMe and jump into the second learning module for the Attacking and Defending AWS learning path. Let's see how it goes. Okay, quick check-in on the Attacking and Defending AWS learning path, how we're doing. So got through the 2 Introduction to AWS rooms, and now we're going to move on to the Introduction to IAM rooms. Looks like we've got in this module 7, plot twist, 7 different rooms to get us going with IAM. The description says, understand the parts of the identity and access management service to get a good foundation for attacking and defending this service, attacking and defending IAM, I guess. IAM is very fundamental to everything in AWS, as you'll see when we go through this. So this is going to be very important, and I imagine going to provide a lot of the building blocks that we'll use in the later modules. With that said, with the hype built, let's get started with this Introduction to AWS IAM room. The description for this room says a brief introduction to the importance of IAM and the IAM module. And looks like it nice in the background. We got some art featuring part of an IAM policy. So we'll get to know all about that. And I notice here we have the option to start our attack box, which is great because that makes me think we're going to start getting a little more hands-on keyboard here and our cloud details. Normally when I get into TryHackMe, the first thing I do is figure out where I need to be starting a box. But for now, I'm actually going to wait since this is my first time going through the cloud rooms. I'm going to just kind of follow instructions and take it as it comes. So task 1 looks like is some more reading about the importance of IAM. Understanding IAM, AWS's Identity and Access Management Service, is critical to attacking or defending an AWS account. IAM is a highly complex service with multiple parts. And in this module, we're going to learn about IAM Principals, which is the people, applications, and AWS services that can act on your AWS account. IAM Policies, which define what a principal can do. IAM Credentials, which are the numerous ways a principal can authenticate to the AWS control plane. So kind of catch the relation here, right? So IAM Principals use IAM Credentials to authenticate to the AWS control plane that we talked about earlier. And then IAM Policies define what that principal can do when they've authenticated. Lastly, here we have least privilege, which is the concept about how to create a policy with minimally scoped permissions and how AWS can make that difficult for a developer. Ooh, interesting. Got a little commentary there. Principle of least privilege is very important if you're getting into any type of cloud security or really any cybersecurity. In cloud IAM policies, we want the principals to have the very minimal permissions necessary for them to do what they absolutely need to do in the cloud. And if you hear the term overscoped IAM policy, overscoped IAM role, that's indicating this is a policy where we have given this principal too much permission. They're able to do way more than they actually need to do to get the function of the job done. Anyway, I could go on and on, but that's like a sneak preview. I'm sure we're going to talk about it more. Next, we see why is IAM so important? With traditional network-centric security, you're dealing with 2 dimensions. You're either inside the firewall or outside the firewall. We have this nice dragon picture to paint the picture. With public clouds like AWS, the network is software defined. So if you ever heard the term software defined networking or SDN, that's what we're getting at, I think. I issue API calls to AWS to control the network. All of these API calls introduce a 3rd dimension. Suddenly, we are no longer defending castles from opposing armies. We are defending castles from dragons. Oh my gosh, this is getting lit now. IAM is how AWS manages access to the APIs that control your network and all the other resources that exist in your account. With the right IAM permissions, I can literally go into your AWS account and do anything. Some of the examples they give here with certain IAM permissions, I could change your firewalls, update the routing tables of your network, and exfiltrate your data from your databases or your object storage. And then it says AWS even has several system management tools that efficiently allow you to pop shells on a machine. As a defender, you need to understand how to defend your cloud accounts and resources against attacks that leverage IAM. As an attacker, you can leverage AWS IAM in a number of ways to compromise a target, move laterally, and exfiltrate data. So hence the name of the learning path, Attacking and Defending AWS. Now we say we understand why IAM is important. You convinced us with your nice dragon metaphor. We hit completed and we will move on to task 2. Task 2 is called Introduction to AWS IAM. Got a good amount of reading to start with here. One of the core principles of identity and access control in AWS is the concept of an AWS account. Amazon treats each account as an independent customer of AWS, and each account is its own independent trust boundary. Inside an AWS account, there can be multiple IAM users, groups, and roles. So remember IAM users, groups, and roles. Those would be examples of IAM principles we just talked about in the last section. Terminology can be confusing, isn't that so true? And people often refer to granting access as giving someone an IAM account. For clarity, we shall always refer to the AWS account as an account and an IAM user inside that account as an IAM user. Make sense? Every AWS account has a root user, and AWS considers that root user the customer. Major customer service interactions need to occur from that root user, including billing changes and closing the account. I believe these were examples we learned in the organizations briefing before, that only the management account of the organization can do these root user actions. So this is connected. The root user is all powerful, remember that, and has complete control over all resources in the account, except for organizational service control policies, which we're going to discuss in a future room, which sounds interesting. I'm excited for that. Since the root user is all powerful and since there is only one, best practice is to create individual IAM users for each person who needs access to the account and only grant the level of access required for their job function. So now we're getting into that least privilege idea, only the level of access required for them to do their job. When creating an account for the first time, the common practice is for the root user to create an admin IAM user and never use root again. That is indeed the best practice. I don't know if I would say it's the common practice, but it is what you should do. You really want to avoid using the root user. You don't want to be logging in as the root user all the time. You should create a day-to-day admin user to use instead. Oh, I swear I didn't read this. At this point, day-to-day access should occur via either IAM users or IAM roles, and IAM users combine authentication, identity, and authorization into a single unit. IAM roles typically delegate the authentication and identity to another system and primarily manage authorization. Interesting. I don't know if I've really thought about it like that before. Let me read that again. IAM users combine authentication, identity, and authorization into a single unit. Okay, well, that does indeed make sense. So your IAM user says who you are and what you're allowed to do. Okay, makes sense. And then IAM roles typically delegate the authentication and identity to another system. Okay, now I get it. Yeah, that is true. And primarily manage authorization. So roles are more focused on authorization. We will discuss users and roles in the next room. Looking forward to it. Both IAM users and IAM roles require IAM policies to be able to do anything. By default, all API requests are implicitly denied. If you remember one thing so far, this is a good thing to remember. All API requests in AWS are implicitly denied. You need to somehow be allowed to do the action before you do it. And if there's no allow anywhere, it's denied by default. We're going to discuss more about policies, how they work in the future, lots of foreshadowing here. For introductory purposes, the user or role is the who can do something, and the policy defines what they can do. IAM policies define the actions that the user or role can perform on a resource. Let's see where this link takes us to. So these would be examples of an action within IAM, and it says here, so it looks like we're looking at IAM itself. And IAM supports approximately 40 actions for a user resource. So the user is the resource. This is 4 examples of the 40 actions we can take on a user resource. So we could create a user, we can delete a user, get a user, etc. Almost everything you create in AWS is a resource, and almost all resources can be identified by their Amazon resource name or ARN. One time, me and a bunch of coworkers got in such a long discussion about if you say this ARN or ARN. I always say ARN, so let me know in the comments if you think that's the wrong way of going about it. ARNs uniquely identify AWS resources. Remember that an ARN is a unique identifier. We require an ARN when you need to specify a resource unambiguously across all of AWS, and you'll use ARNs in places like IAM policies to specify action in relation to a specific resource identified by ARN, tags, and API calls. Okay, lots of reading. Thanks for sticking with me so far. Hopefully it's remaining interesting. I think we're going to get to something hands-on soon. An ARN consists of the region, account ID, service, and some identifiers for the resource, commonly the resource's name. You know you're really like an AWS hardo at AWS Pro when you start being able to construct these ARNs from memory. I use ARNs constantly, especially writing infrastructure as code. Like in my Terraform, I have a lot of logic that has to do with ARNs and stuff like that. So here's an example of an ARN. It starts with ARN, then AWS, then the service, EC2 in this case, then the region, then the account ID, then for EC2, we have the instance ID here as an identifier. So that's an example of an ARN for an EC2 resource. Here's another example. Looks like this is an IAM role. So again, it starts with ARN, AWS, the IAM service. You might remember IAM is a global service. We learned that in one of the other rooms before. So there's no region identifier here. And then the account ID and then role / the role name. And role names need to be unique within accounts. Don't ask me how I know that. I've learned it the hard way many, many times. Now, we got some trivia. ARNs almost always begin with ARN AWS. The second field is called the partition. So this part right here, AWS, is called the partition. And we learned about partitions in one of those other rooms you might remember. Most AWS customers are in the AWS partition. I've often heard the AWS partition called the commercial regions or the standard regions, but the AWS partition is basically like almost every region within AWS. But there are several other partitions, including GovCloud, the China region, and a handful of other partitions built for the US government. So what they're getting at is that the ARNs for those other partitions that are not the main partition would have a different value here after ARN. It wouldn't be ARN AWS. It would be ARN AWS CN to indicate the China partition, for example. This requires the use of an access key and secret key and an optional session token to authenticate calls to the AWS APIs. These keys sign the request and identify which user or role and which AWS account the requests come from. We will discuss credentials in more detail in a later room, and I bet that is going to be a fun room if I had to predict. Multiple AWS accounts can be members of an organization. We learned about that earlier as well. This is typically done for management and consolidated billing purposes. Typically, there is no implicit trust across accounts in an organization. However, AWS has introduced some new features that blur the boundary and allow the organization management account to modify and manage the member accounts. Oh, I love AWS architecture diagrams. Here's a nice little diagram about what they're talking about. So here we're in the boundaries of an AWS organization, and you remember AWS organizations typically consist of multiple AWS accounts that are member accounts, and typically they're organized in organizational units. So here's one AWS account in the organization, and we have a couple examples of the principals we were talking about earlier. So we have the IAM user, which is an IAM principal, and the IAM user has a few different things going on. So the IAM user authenticates as that user with long-term security credentials. I hope we're going to get into this more in this learning path, but really the more you can avoid long-term security credentials in AWS, the better. And it's getting easier and easier to do that. I have some other videos about it. So that's just like a sidebar plug. You really, if you can avoid even using these long-term security credentials, that's even better. But traditionally, that's what a user authenticates with. And then the user is also a member of an IAM group. And both the user and the group can have IAM policies attached to them that impact what that user would be able to do. So what the user is able to do in an AWS account depends on the IAM policies directly attached to the user and also the IAM policies attached to any group the user is a member of. And then also in this AWS account, we have an IAM role, and the IAM role authenticates with temporary security credentials, which is almost always preferable. So that's why I can't remember if I've already said this in one of these videos, but I do say this a lot. Whenever you're taking an AWS exam, a little tip, especially if it's like the security exam or if it's a question about security, if you have an option that involves assuming an IAM role and using temporary security credentials, that's almost always going to be the right answer, because that's almost always the best practice, because the temporary security credentials are a lot more secure than using long-term credentials. Anyway, I'm sure I'll probably repeat that about 5 more times going forward. The IAM role also has IAM policies attached to it that is going to determine what the entity that assumes that IAM role is going to be able to do using those temporary security credentials. So that's a little bit of an overview. I don't really know why this diagram involves the AWS organization, because this is just more like a basic IAM diagram. But I guess just to get the point across, this would be true even if the account was not in an AWS organization. So we scroll down here, and once again, okay, so no flag or anything. We just hit completed, and there we go. Okay, whoop, whoop. Another room down, very nicely done. We didn't have to spin up any of these machines, so that's interesting. I thought we were probably going to have to, but I'm sure we're going to soon. So stay excited, and hopefully I will see you in the next room.